May 1776. King Louis has decided to back a rebellion in the New World against France's old enemy, Great Britain. By June 1778, a brand new French fleet of 30 ships of the line stands ready at Brest to take on the old enemy in open battle. Opposing them was a British fleet of roughly similar size under the command of the respected Admiral Sir Augustus Keppel. Should he be able to decisively defeat the French in open battle, the French would have been forced out of the war and the young American nation would be removed from the map entirely. Should he lose, however, the entire British Empire would be endangered. The fate of an empire and that of a young nation depended on what would happen next. While British subjects in North America had taken up arms against their sovereign, the shrewd political operator and diplomat Vergennes had seized this moment to push forth an agenda to reduce the old enemy Britain to size in order to recreate a balance of power. This balance of power in his eyes had been destroyed by Britain's total victory in the 7 Years' War. Vergennes had previously won a battle of court intrigue against the only opponent to his agenda, the reformer Turgot, and was now practically ruling France together with the king's favorite minister Maurepas and the naval minister Patron. The king, being unexperienced and an unconfrontative people-pleaser, had no agenda of his own. Vergennes, although being fully aware of the risk of such policies, had managed to convince the Royal Council that covert support for the Americans by delivering money, weapons and supplies was possible without entering into a direct war. On the 2nd of May 1776, Louis approves his first 1 million livres to be delivered to the American rebels. Meanwhile in London, His Majesty's government under Lord North was already on high alert. Not only because of rumors of a supposed French rearmament, but also because her ally Portugal had started a war over colonies in South America with France's ally Spain that same year. That crisis had escalated over territory in modern-day Uruguay and southern Brazil, where Portugal had assembled an army over 9,000 men to wrestle control over these areas, defended by only 1.7k Spanish soldiers. Spain had thus already mobilized 17 of her own ships of the line at Cadiz in response and started mustering an army. Britain was anxious that this crisis could spill over to Europe and prompt Spain's ally France to join the war, forcing Britain in turn to defend Portugal. Vergennes' decision to support the American rebels made the situation even tenser. Although Vergennes' government at this point was gearing up for a fight, he knew very well that an intervention at this moment was not an option for France. The French Navy had begun to mobilize, but was far from ready to fight the British Royal Navy just yet. France's training squadron stationed at Brest was the only one immediately ready, comprising 17 ships, of which only 3 were ships of the line. Opposing them in the Channel were 20 ships of the line of the British Royal Navy called the Guard ships. The French Training and Observation Squadron was sent out to patrol the Biscay, depriving the French coast of warships. Louis thus ordered 6 more ships of the line to be armed to fill the void. Shortly thereafter, British Ambassador Stromont at Versailles informed Vergennes that Britain will be adding 15 more ships to the line to the Guard fleet, bringing it up to 35 ships of the line. The Spanish meanwhile urged Vergennes to join the war against Portugal. Vergennes knew that should he now give in to Spanish pressure, his plan for a well-coordinated attack on the British Empire would fail, and thus turned down the Spanish overtures. Thus, all Spain could do was to provide the American rebels with 1 million livres too in an effort to prolong the rebellion to be able to finish the Portuguese War before Britain could intervene. With the Portuguese War now fully contained in South America, France could focus on rearmament. Vergennes, emboldened by the failure of the British forces in North America to put down or de-escalate the situation in North America, kept pursuing the rebuilding of the French fleet over the summer of 1776. By August, 20 additional ships of the line were ready at Brest, and Naval Minister Patron ordered all 20 of them into commission immediately. This sudden and extreme rearmament caught the French port cities massively off guard. Vergennes program had created a sudden and massive competition for materiel and workers in the docks. As previously the Navy was massively underfunded, there simply weren't enough stores and building materials to keep up with the demand the rearmament facilitated. The cost of arming these 20 additional ships exceeded 8 million livres, and the Navy had already spent 16.2 million livres this year alone, of an official naval budget of only 11 million. The missing money was quickly appropriated to the Navy after the fact, as royal resistance to this unauthorized excess spending was quickly overturned. This set a dangerous precedent for excess spending in advance. Patron ordered a second squadron to be prepared for the next year without the king's knowledge or consent. The massive 110-gun first-rate Bretagne was also ordered to be overhauled without being in either of those squadrons, again without the king's knowledge or consent. Over the summer and fall, relations deteriorated even more as a consequence of this rapid rearmament. In December, the British government started issuing letters of marque, allowing private ship owners to arm their vessels for privateering. This further increased the need for French warships on the French coast. To add to the rising tensions, the American commissioners Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin reached Paris that winter. Vergennes' foreign policy was getting closer and closer to a point of no return. By the start of 1777, France had managed to get into a state of readiness, 37 ships of the line. Britain, at the same time, had 82 ships of the line in serviceable condition, of which 35 were on guard duty in the Channel. Thus, Vergennes had to for now keep the support for the American rebels low enough to not escalate into open war. Setting to sea all of France's ready 37 ships of the line immediately would have instantly depleted the entire stockpile of naval materiel in French ports. To remedy the situation, French Naval Minister Patron ordered a massive resupply campaign for all French ports. In doing that, he again way overspent his regular naval budget. He went on a massive shopping spree, ordering naval material from all over Europe to be brought to France. The early onset of good weather in 1777 allowed for the ports to be resupplied entirely by April. 10 more frigates were also ordered at Brest, although these were slightly postponed due to lack of wood. At the Mediterranean port of Toulon, 6 more ships were ordered to reinforce the fleet, which could then reinforce the Atlantic if need be. French port cities, especially Brest, previously quiet and sleepy, became a flurry of activity. Carpenters and workers from all over France swept into the port cities, taking up jobs at the naval docks. The ports became a tourist attraction for nobility and even royalty from all over Europe. Austrian Crown Prince Joseph even visited the port of Brest incognito for a special summer vacation. The work that was now being done at the docks far outscaled everything done in the previous year. Ever more politicians in London began to doubt Vergennes' sincerity, and political pressure on the North government was building. While Patron was busy directing this enormous rearmament, Vergennes had to balance between arming the Americans, arming France's own navy, and preventing a premature war with Britain. Incidents at sea were also occurring at an alarming rate. British patrols were extended to the Bay of Biscay to intercept American shipping. Du Chaffaut set out from Brest again with a squadron under orders to protect any ship that sought protection, a clear provocation to Britain. A small patrol under Captain Lamont-Piquet even fired warning shots at the British ship of the line Exeter to stay away from the French coast. He also provocatively signaled to the Exeter that he would protect any ship under any flag. He was reprimanded by French High Command later, yet this showed to Vergennes that the actors on the ground could easily violate his careful conduct towards Britain. Another such unforeseen escalation was the Marquis de Lafayette, who joined the American army as a volunteer. French ally Spain, meanwhile, herself becoming nervous from all the British rearmament, requested French reinforcements for the Caribbean and suggested to form a joint squadron there to deter the British. Spain's war in South America also came to an end as the Spanish Navy managed to achieve a decisive victory over the Portuguese Navy and subsequently captured the island of St. Catherine, dooming any further Portuguese attempts at conquest. Vergennes, however, refused to reinforce the Caribbean as he knew that as long as Washington's army in America was still not destroyed, Britain could not spare the land forces to attack either France or Spain. Spain had to content herself reinforcing her colonies alone. Another situation spiraling out of Vergennes' control was the usage of French bases by American privateers. He had instructed Duchaffaut to block any American privateers from entering French ports. Boat commanders on the French coast, however, were not eager to follow these instructions. American privateers even entered British home waters and sold captured prizes at Lorient and other ports. Among American privateers who used the French ports during that year was a man often called the father of the American Navy, John Paul Jones, who would sally out of the French port of Nantes to terrorize the British waters. In June, the American privateer Lambert Wickes captured 18 British merchant ships off the coast of England and went into Saint-Malo. That same month, famous American privateer Conyngham had entered Dunkirk after being chased away by British warships. British Ambassador Stromont at Versailles, already busy complaining to Vergennes and Maurepas, protested it strongly, which prompted Vergennes to eject the American privateers out of Dunkirk. Conyngham himself, however, was given a cutter and false papers, and he escaped to Norway after, with obvious French complicity in his escape. Wickes' squadron, however, was still remaining in Saint-Malo. Nathaniel Forth Parker, an agent of the North Cabinet, subsequently warned the French Minister of State Maurepas that British public opinion at home was already aggravated by the French behavior. He demanded that the French publish their orders not allowing the privateers and pirates to use their ports, to which Vergennes promptly complied. The French also confiscated Wickes' prizes and he had to leave Saint-Malo without escort. Forth's visit sparked a panic in the French Royal Council. To Vergennes it seemed that his plan had failed and that war was imminent. The fishing fleet was hastily recalled from Newfoundland on the 26th of August and ships in the Caribbean were forbidden from leaving port. Vergennes' panic, however, at the end turned out to be unjustified. On the 14th of September, the crisis simmered away and the British did not see this as a cause to escalate into open war. The crisis thus had only served Vergennes and Satrine, who were now able to spend even more unauthorized money on the navy, accelerating rearmament even further. During the crisis, Spain had offered her full backing, but Vergennes only received this after the crisis had ended. After the crisis, the British resorted to searching ships of all flags suspected to partake in illicit arms smuggling to the Americans, which soured relations with neutral powers like the Dutch. Although one crisis had passed, the spiral of escalation had already begun, and the simmering of tensions would prove to be only the calm before the inevitable storm. The Council's official decision for war, however, seems to have been much older than the summer crisis. Vergennes' assistant Naval had prepared a memoir before the crisis that stated a direct French involvement would be necessary to prevent the Americans from making a separate peace. Thus, France needed to formalize her relations with the US and recognize her, which would lead to open war. The memoir advocated for a squadron to be assembled to destroy Admiral Howe's fleet off New York. This proposal would finally end up being implemented almost one-to-one. After the crisis was over, Vergennes prepared a memoir through King Louis to the king's uncle Charles III of Spain, asking him for advice on the matter. This was a rhetorical device presenting the war as a joint effort. Once the fishing fleet was back from Newfoundland, both kingdoms could strike with impunity. Should they wait past February, the opportunity was gone. Spain, however, was no friend of a free nation in the Americas, potentially threatening her own empire in the future. Ideologically, too, Spain was opposed to both republicanism and Protestantism. The Spanish silver fleet from Mexico would also not arrive in time, leaving Spain no other option than to refuse. Nevertheless, France's decision on the matter was already made, and by the end of the year, going back was not an option anymore. By then, nearly every day, amateur strategists and glory-seeking aristocrats were sending in their grandiose plans for invading Britain and completely destroying her empire. Lower-level decision-makers were already disregarding Versailles' orders, and an arms and privateering industry in France herself was already springing up. In the eyes of many Frenchmen, then, not only honor, but also business dictated a direct French involvement in the war. In early December 1777, news of a British defeat at Saratoga arrived in Europe. Contrary to popular belief, the battle is not the reason for the French entry into the war. It was more the work of the French stockyards than the work of the American soldiers that gave France the confidence to enter the war directly. By January 1778, France had managed to crew and make ready 66 ships of the line. Opposing them at this exact time were only 56 crewed and ready British ships of the line, with 19 additional ones arming and 8 being in good condition. Thus, for this campaigning season, France could achieve parity with the British, even without the assistance of the 45 Spanish ships that could have served in this campaigning season. Washington was defeated twice the previous year at Germantown and Brandywine, which signaled to the French that the American army could not defeat the British without help. If not the cause, Saratoga served as an excuse for the French. Previously, Franklin had threatened Vergennes with a separate peace if France did not join immediately to help America. News also came from across the Channel that Lord North wanted to raise the issue of reconciliation in Parliament on January 29th. Vergennes had enough political acumen to know that these threats were empty. A reconciliation at this point was out of the picture. It served him well, however, at the meeting of the council as ammunition to finally push for the direct entry into the war. Over the course of December 1777, diplomatic preparations commenced. On the 17th, the Americans formally conceded to never reconciling with Britain, essentially ruling out a separate peace. Vergennes also tried to threaten Spain into the alliance with America with the supposed possibility of reconciliation, but this effort ultimately failed. On the 31st, Spanish First Minister Florida Blanca made it unmistakably clear that they wanted no alliance with America under any circumstances. Instead, Ambassador Aranda offered 1.2 million livres as further subsidy for the Americans. In early January 1778, the French Royal Council officially approved the American alliance. Vergennes had the confidence to confront the British even without the Spanish ships, because in this campaigning season he could achieve temporary parity with them. France could impress sailors from her coastal shipping to crew her warships, and the sailors from the Newfoundland fishing fleet were already safely home. Britain in turn relied on merchant shipping for her sailors, and the great trade convoys needed time to come home again. France would have the element of surprise, and the British superiority in numbers would be marginal. Unless Britain was defeated in this one campaign, the addition of the roughly 50 manable Spanish ships of the line would be indispensable. If, however, France was decisively defeated in this campaigning season, 1759 would repeat and America would fall. On the 4th of February, all preparations were finally over. France then officially signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the United States. The treaty was officially ratified by Congress on the 4th of April, which prompted an immediate breaking of relations with Britain. In Britain, this prompted a complete reworking of the war strategy. Washington's army, although repeatedly defeated, was never definitively destroyed. Attacking the revolution at its heart by taking the capital, Philadelphia, had also failed to break the revolutionaries' resolve. The British cabinet was now open to abandon Philadelphia and concentrate on New York. Now, instead of trying to defeat the revolution entirely, the government hoped to retain at least the southern colonies and New York as a valuable harbor for the Royal Navy. The cabinet immediately ordered 5,000 soldiers from Britain to be sent to the Caribbean to take the French island of St. Lucia as a springboard to move against Martinique. This strategy, however, had many flaws which would prove disastrous for the British later. Britain had no superiority in either of those theaters of war, and New York was an extremely difficult place to defend, which meant a large number of troops would be wasted on garrison duty. This presented the allies of France and America with the initiative everywhere. Britain had no fleet in the Mediterranean, which made it possible for the French Mediterranean fleet to reinforce the Brest fleet and strike Britain herself, or strike the numerically inferior British fleet at New York. The French Royal Council in the end decided to send the Toulon fleet of 10 ships of the line under D'Estaing to America to destroy the British fleet there, and then split up in 2 squadrons, one for Newfoundland and the other for the West Indies. The British quickly learned of D'Estaing's departure but did not know his destination. They could have intercepted him at Gibraltar, but the new British operations brought the Guard fleet down to only 20 ships of the line, which made this too risky. Britain also did not want to officially start hostilities for hopes of invoking the British-Dutch defensive alliance. D'Estaing passed Gibraltar on the 16th of May, 5 weeks after his departure from Toulon. On the 2nd of June, a British squadron of 13 ships of the line under Vice Admiral Byron left for America to chase him down. The French knew of Byron's departure and destination and could have gone after him with d'Olivier's squadron at Brest, consisting of 27 ships of the line, with 4 additional ones being armed. Opposing d'Olivier was the British Guard fleet under Admiral of the Blue Augustus Keppel with 21 ships of the line. Though admitted to be one of Britain's finest admirals, he was a friend of Pitt, Burke and Sheridan, and the influential and brilliant group of Whig landlords and London merchants who consistently had opposed the war against America. His political views made him a controversial figure in the Navy and made him many enemies among his fellow officers, many of whom were in Parliament themselves. Especially problematic was that Vice Admiral Hugh Palliser had received a subordinate command under Keppel. Palliser was a stern supporter of the government and saw the Americans, and indeed many Whigs, as traitors. Not only was Keppel a Whig, but also a sick man. He was tormented by a terrible gout and had been taking the waters for his ailment at Aix-la-Chapelle, France, only a few months before being recalled to command. Keppel chose to raise his flag on the 1763-built 100-gun 3-decker HMS Victory, which would later serve under Nelson at Trafalgar. The upcoming showdown with d'Olivier would prove her first naval engagement. On the 12th of June, Keppel's fleet left port to patrol the Channel. Olivier wanted to bring Keppel to battle, but only if he was sure that Byron couldn't intervene. For lack of intelligence, d'Olivier stayed in port for the remainder of the month. France also still needed an official casus belli. This came on the 17th of June when Admiral Keppel met the frigate La Belle Poule with a small detachment of 1 ship of the line and 3 frigates. The seemingly mad captain La Clochetterie of the Belle Poule had refused presenting to the British Admiral, which prompted an uneven fight between Keppel's detachment and the lone frigate. The Belle Poule's crew suffered 40% casualties in the engagement, and her hull and rigging were considerably damaged. Miraculously, the Belle Poule escaped, with 1 other French frigate that happened to be nearby captured by the British, presenting Vergennes with the excuse for war he needed. Olivier finally received sailing orders on the 2nd of July and left port on the 8th with 32 ships of the line. Keppel too left Portsmouth again after a brief stay in port on the 7th with 21 ships of the line. His mission was to safely escort into port the Jamaica trade convoy. With the convoy's escort and other reinforcements, his force was up to 29 ships of the line. Now both opposing fleets were roughly of equal size. Olivier's orders, however, were much more defensive than the ones of Keppel. He should stay at the western entrance to the Channel and threaten the British lifelines of trade there instead of entering it. France had no deep water port in the Channel, and should he be forced ashore by a superior British squadron there, the outcome would be disastrous. He should also only fight if conditions were favorable and avoid battle otherwise. He knew his captains and crews were inexperienced in comparison to the British ones, and Vergennes was not keen on risking his new shiny fleet in a major battle. His plan was clearly that if he should be brought to battle, to mirror the British movements and to preserve his fleet. Olivier had a background in the army, as did many of his captains serving in the colony of French Guiana as an infantry officer before joining the Navy at age 19. Most British officers, on the contrary, grew up at sea. Keppel's fleet also possessed 7 3-deckers of 90 guns or more versus the French 1. Thus Olivier's situation was precarious, and decisive action by Keppel could end the war and thus American independence, then and there. On a clear afternoon on the 23rd of July, lookouts in Keppel's fleet spotted a large number of sails on the southeastern horizon. Keppel knew that this must be d'Olivier's fleet. His orders were clear and simple: find and destroy the Brest fleet. At the time of sighting, the French fleet was to leeward of the British, with the safe harbour of Brest behind them. This meant Keppel held the weather gauge. This was perfect for him because he could sail downwind into the French, forcing them to battle. If they should escape, he could blockade them in Brest. His only issue now was time. At the time of sighting, it was already afternoon. Sailors of both fleets nevertheless prepared the ships for battle, clearing the decks of hammocks, tables, benches and personal items. D'Olivier, fearing to be pushed into a blockade, wore his ships around from his northeasterly course and formed a line of battle on a southeasterly course. By the time the British came closer, daylight was already fading. Every admiral of the Age of Sail dreaded night battles, as in an age where communication from the admiral to his fleet was conducted via flags. A night battle was not an option. When daylight was gone, the French were still downwind. If Keppel was to keep his position upwind of the French overnight, his strategy would work out. In the late evening hours, however, the wind shifted from west-northwest to southwest. Olivier knew that his position was precarious and thus decided to use the darkness and the sudden wind shift to his advantage. In a stunning night maneuver, he ordered his ships to wear and head north-northwest. Not seeing this, Keppel kept station, awaiting a decisive battle that was supposed to take place the next day. When daylight broke on the 24th, Olivier was already to windward of the British and way to the north. Realizing his mistake, Keppel gave chase immediately. The French meanwhile used their distance to tack deeper and deeper into the Atlantic. This chase would go on for the entire day and would end up being repeated for 2 more days after. This chase was extremely demanding on crews of both sides, as the enormous fleets of 30 ships each had to be maneuvered while keeping a functioning battle line intact. 2 French captains would end up being lost one night and not finding the fleet again. Keppel, growing impatient to force a general engagement, signaled a general chase, which resulted in a disorderly loose formation, exactly what Olivier wanted. At 6 a.m. on a cloudy morning on the 27th, both fleets were approximately 8 miles apart from each other, with the French still being dead to windward of the British, with the wind coming from south-southwest. The British Van Division under Vice Admiral of the Red, Robert Harland, was closest to the enemy, with the Centre Division under Keppel himself beside him. The Rear Division under Palliser was still way to leeward. Keppel, seeing a French battle line forming, ordered the Rear Division to chase to windward. At 9 p.m., Keppel saw the French battle line wear in succession, giving away some of their wind. This, however, did not mean that the French could be forced to battle now, as they would still be to windward. Then suddenly, as the French were conducting their maneuver, the wind shifted more southerly. This was exactly what Keppel had hoped for 3 days at this point. A sleep-deprived but suddenly hopeful Keppel ordered a flurry of signals to be hoisted on the mast of HMS Victory. His fleet first used the wind shift to get closer to the French. Then Keppel signaled to get on the same tack as the enemy to finally force the battle he had so desperately sought. Shortly after the British had completed their maneuver at 10:15 a.m., a thick mist came up and it began to rain. Sight was suddenly extremely poor and both fleets were forced to keep station. Keppel, already disappointed, thinking his chance was gone, was relieved when at 11 a.m. the sky suddenly cleared again. The French had apparently maneuvered again during this time. Now his time to strike had finally come. If he just continued on the current course, he would undoubtedly catch the French rear and completely destroy it. Olivier, seeing this development from his flagship, ordered his entire fleet to wear again. This thwarted Keppel's plan of isolating the French rear, and both lines were heading towards each other on a parallel course. Now, for the first time in 4 days of maneuvering, the 2 fleets finally came to battle. The sailors, tired of waiting, gave hearty cheers of Vive le Roi and God Save the King as the fleets closed in. British ships tried to get closer to unleash their broadsides. The first ship to open fire was the French Bourgogne, giving a thundering broadside, tearing into the rigging of HMS Robust. Robust answered in kind, and from here the barrage became general. The distance was still too great to cause critical damage, nevertheless several hits were scored on both sides, and the sheer amount of guns fired, and the relatively light winds, made it so that visibility was getting impaired. After some time, HMS Victory, very close haul, breached the engagement. Keppel was determined to send a double-shotted broadside into the Bretagne, Olivier's flagship, and thus ordered his gun crews to hold fire. In doing so, he passed multiple French ships, which all unleashed their broadsides into Victory. Her rigging suffered the most, as most of the French projectiles hitting her was chain shot. Shot passed thick everywhere, and blocks from the rigging whistled down onto the decks, crushing any sailor that was unfortunate enough to stand in its way. Most dangerous were, as one British surgeon reported, ragged splinters of oak, which tore into the sailors, maiming and wounding them. When Victory finally reached the Bretagne, her first salvo was devastating, ripping a trail of destruction into de Olivier's flagship. The experienced British gunners quickly reloaded and engaged the other French ships passing. The French, for their lack of three-deckers, took devastating damage to their hulls by the passing British first-rates. Pallas's rear division, meanwhile, trying to get into the engagement, had completely missed their mark and in the confusion and smoke ended up chaotically spread behind the main British line. Some captains, confused by the smoke which was piling up to leeward of the main battle line, started firing on friendly ships. Some British ships inside battle line, having suffered considerable damage to their rigging, also fell to leeward to make repairs. After some time, HMS Victory had passed the French line and tried to reverse and chase the French again. Her rigging, however, was badly shot up, so that she had to cautiously wear instead of tacking. Only at 2 p.m. she was on the correct tack again. A few minutes later, the battle signal was hauled down, and the form line of battle signal was hoisted. Keppel wanted to reform his line of battle to protect his damaged ship to leeward and to make a concentrated attack again. Vice Admiral Harland, commanding the van division, was quick to follow the signal, and his ships formed around their admiral. Defying his admiral, Palliser formed a separate battle line to windward, intending to directly continue the attack. His personal dislike of the Whig admiral might have played a part in his decision. De Olivier was quick to notice British disorder and was eager to exploit it. Already in 1300, Olivier had given a signal to wear in succession. He had intended to circumvent the chaotic British formation and to hit the damaged British ships to leeward. His decision might have perhaps decided the battle in France's favor. His signal, however, was not heard by the ship leading the French battle line, and thus the fleet kept its course. Only when another French ship in the battle line repeated the signal, the maneuver was executed too late, at 2 p.m. By this time, Keppel had already understood Olivier's intention, and instead of chasing the French directly like Palliser did, he intended to fall downwind with Harland's division to protect his damaged ships. At 4 p.m. the French were again formed up to leeward in a battle line, and Keppel's and Harland's division were opposing them, forming their own line. Keppel wanted to bear down onto the French line again, this time from windward, to bring British superior gunnery to bear. Palliser's rear division, however, was still absent from the line. At 5 p.m. Keppel sent a frigate to Palliser, ordering him to rejoin the battle line. When Palliser's division still did not move by 7 p.m, Keppel ordered the individual ships from the division to rejoin the battle line. By this time, daylight was already fading and it was too late to renew the attack. The night was spent conducting repairs and tending to the wounded. On the next morning, on the first light, the French sails were still visible on the horizon. By afternoon, they slipped out of sight. The French fleet immediately returned to port. The British fleet too suffered too much battle damage to conduct a blockade and withdrew to Portsmouth. Neither side had suffered any ship sunk or captured in the battle. The French suffered 126 killed and 413 wounded. The British suffered 407 killed and 789 wounded. The Duc de Chartres, Louis-Philippe II d'Orléans, a French prince of royal blood who took part in the battle, requested permission to carry the news of its outcome to Paris and Versailles. He arrived there in the early morning hours of August 2nd, had Louis XVI woken and announced the victory. Chartres was widely celebrated and received a 20-minute standing ovation when he attended the Paris Opera. An effigy of Admiral Keppel was burned in the gardens of the royal residence of the Palais Royal. Chartres then returned to Brest to rejoin the fleet. Then, however, fresh reports of the battle and Chartres' role in it began to arrive in the French capital. Far from a victory, it was reported to be indecisive at best, and Chartres was accused by de Olivier of either misunderstanding or deliberately ignoring an order to engage the enemy. Chartres was soon mocked by street ballots in Paris, and the embarrassment led to his eventual resignation from the navy. The captains of the two French ships that went missing on July 23rd and 24th were also reprimanded. Nevertheless, the French had shown in this battle that they could stand toe-to-toe with the British Royal Navy in a fight. The battle, although indecisive, would serve as a great source of confidence for the French Navy throughout the war. In Britain, meanwhile, the personal conflict and political tensions between Keppel and Palliser boiled over. Many saw the battle as a missed opportunity to end the war, perhaps rightly so. Keppel, in turn, accused Palliser of disobeying orders, and many in the British public agreed. Pamphlets began circulating accusing Palliser of preventing a victory. When Palliser demanded that Keppel publicly refute these accusations, Keppel did not respond. In November, the quarrel reached Parliament. The House of Commons, supported by Lord Sandwich, demanded an inquiry into the matter. A court-martial was subsequently convened, during which Palliser accused Keppel of neglecting his duties as an admiral and blamed the missed opportunity on him. The court-martial lasted 27 days, with Keppel awaiting the death penalty if he was found guilty. He was, however, cleared of all charges, and the verdict was widely celebrated by his supporters. He subsequently went on to stay active in politics, sharply criticizing the government on naval matters in Parliament. He would eventually become First Lord of the Admiralty when the North government fell in 1782. The battle, although indecisive, had far-reaching strategic consequences. It meant that the American Revolution could go on, as the Americans' backers in Europe were not decisively defeated. It also meant, however, that another campaigning season was imminent, and France could not hope to stand alone against British sea power. An entry of Spain into the war was now necessary to prevent a complete collapse of the French Navy and, by extension, the American Revolution. For Vergennes, this meant that the Spanish would need to be convinced into a war for a cause they did not agree with. A diplomatic battle lay ahead for Vergennes, and many more battles would follow in the coming 4 years. Make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button not to miss my videos on said battles. The next video of this series will be covering the exciting night action of the Moonlight Battle. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. If you want to converse with me directly, feel free to join my Discord server, link in description. If you want access to more in-depth historical facts and analyses I come across during my research, you can become a Patron supporter for just $2 a month. Patrons, of course, will be given special consideration when suggesting video topics. If you have missed the last naval battle, feel free to click the next video. With that said, thank you again so much for watching, goodbye and au revoir.